For many young people around the world, Korean culture was more than just entertainment. It became a community, a style, and even a part of their identity. From music and dramas to fashion and beauty, the Hallyu Wave has influenced how a generation sees culture, representation, and what's considered cool. But how did Korean pop culture become such a powerful global force? Today I'm speaking with Sasha, a student from Ukraine currently living in Korea, to hear how Korean culture first entered her life and how that interest eventually became something much more personal.
My name is Sasha and I am from Ukraine. I'm currently a first semester student at Yonsei GSIS and I plan to be an international cooperation major and I am 26 years old.
How were you first introduced to Korean culture?
I believe it was around middle school that I first got to know Korean culture because until then, as a kid, I knew Korea existed, but I didn't know much about it. I think when I started using the internet more as like an early teenager, maybe I was around 12 or 13 years old, I saw Korean like K-pop music videos on YouTube, and I think that's how it started. That I just started listening to some K-pop. I can't say that I was like particularly interested in any group, but I would say around that time I started becoming interested in Korea in general, and I think that was when the Hallyu Wave was actually expanding more to the West.
What drew you in and what kept your interest over time?
I think definitely from the beginning for me, it was catchy music and the high quality production, and I feel like visuals that weren't really present in media in Ukraine or like just Western media that I was consuming. And I think as I got older, there was just more and more cultural export from Korea. So I definitely think for me it started with K-pop, but then I quickly also found out about K-dramas. And as I got older, I think in around high school, maybe it was like 2016, I started getting into Korean beauty and makeup and skincare. I think that was around the time that it actually started becoming global and just popular in general. And so I remember watching a lot of like haul videos about Korean makeup and just reviews on Korean makeup. And because I was so interested in that, I remember I would actually order it online. And it wasn't as widely available back then as it is now. But I have to say that was definitely like something that really got me into just, well, Korea as a whole.
How do you think Korean pop culture has changed the way Asian identity is viewed in the West?
I think Korean pop culture has definitely helped us expand the understanding of East Asian culture in particular in the West because, well, like I said before, middle school, I would say I wasn't very aware. I think I was mostly aware of like Japanese culture because they have a huge cultural export in the form of like video games and anime. I think for Korea, at that point, I was only aware of the electronics industry such as Samsung and cars. So until the rise of K-pop and K-dramas, it was difficult for me to even imagine what life in Korea would look like and how the people are. But I think in the past, especially 10 years, Korean media has become so popular and it definitely obviously portrays a bit of an idealized version of things, and of course it's all art, it's media, it's not necessarily a reflection of daily life in Korea, but I think it just started to feel more closer to the audiences in the West and places like Eastern Europe. I think through media, through music, through just dramas and things like that in general, people just realize that, well, we have more in common than we think, but also the things that are different, they just seem interesting and it's something novel that people just want to know more about. So I think the popularity of K-pop and other K-wave cultural exports, they truly just helped to show that, well, there's a lot more to East Asia than what people knew.
Has your perception of Korea changed because of this exposure?
My personal perception has definitely changed, but I feel like rather than just changing perception, I became more aware and I just became more knowledgeable and more interested in learning about like traditional Korean culture and like food and just more about Korean history, because I feel like the Korean wave on its own, obviously there's a lot of interesting things that you can see through K-dramas and K-pop groups and that whole fandom culture, but obviously if you actually want to know more about the society, you need to dig into the traditional aspects of it, the history and the politics, and how the society has been growing since, well, the Korean War and things like that, because it's impossible for these things to exist in a vacuum. So I feel like for someone like myself who's very interested in other cultures and learning languages, I would say that my perception was definitely just I got to know more and I just realized how rich the Korean culture is and just how much there is to learn in general, and that it's not just the K-pop that is popular, but there's just way more under that iceberg, so to speak. But I do think that things like K-pop like just gave way for people to be more interested in Korea in general.
Has Korean pop culture influenced your personal style, hobbies, or the way you express yourself? If so, how?
I think there isn't any like obvious way that I would say Korean culture has affected my personal style or hobbies. Well, aside from the fact that there was a time when I was really into like listening to K-pop, I still casually listen to a lot of it. But as to personal style, I would say yes, especially because I do live in Korea, so I tend to gravitate towards local brands and local trends. And I do also like Korean makeup, but I would have to say that my style is definitely a mix of, well, what I just like personally, be it more Western brands or Korean brands or brands from other countries or things like that. So I do think that my hobbies that used to include like watching a lot of K-dramas when I was a teenager definitely influenced who I am today, but that's what I mean, that it's not something that's entirely obvious. I just think that, well, everything that we consume kind of just makes us up as an identity later on.
Do you feel like K culture created a sense of community for you, online or offline?
Yes, I definitely have to say I have felt the influence of fandom in K culture both online and offline. So, for example, when I was a teenager and I wanted to go to my first K pop concert, I believe it was back in 2017, I did have friends online who were also going, and I ended up meeting them in person at that concert. So I have to say, it's like definitely uniting. And even though I'm again not as much into all of that recently, I still keep in touch with some of the friends. And even though we kind of, I would say, in a way, outgrew that type of phase and those interests, we still keep in touch and we still care about Korea. All considering I live in Korea, my other friends, especially one of my closest friends, she lives in America, but still, I would say that, well, it definitely bridges people from all over the world, because I feel like when I did go to concerts, I would have met like a lot of people, and necessarily K-pop did bring us together, but I can't say that it's like something that we keep on talking about with each other. But I feel like it does bring people together, and if you click, you stay friends for a long time. So through like my love for certain groups or dramas, I definitely made some close connections that are with me to this day.
Did your interest in Korean culture ever influence your decisions, like studying abroad, traveling, or learning the language?
Yes, definitely. I started learning Korean on my own in around middle school when I got into K-pop, but I wouldn't say that got much deeper than like learning how to read and learning the alphabet and just like some simple phrases. However, I did travel to Korea later on because I was more interested in things like fashion and trying Korean food. And so, even in Ukraine, there was a point where I would try Korean dishes because we did, even like 10 years ago, we did have Korean restaurants that I would like to go to. And I think these days it's only becoming more and more trendy to eat like K barbecue and tteokbokki and things like that.
Is there anything that surprised you when you eventually learned more about Korea beyond pop culture?
Yes, I think when I started digging more into Korean history specifically, having seen just the high quality of the video production and music here in Korea, I didn't know that it hasn't been that long that Korea has been so highly technologically advanced, and especially having learned about things like the Korean War and just the many hardships that Koreans have endured like in the past century, and like how they struggled to even get the democracy that they have now. um, I feel like that sort of like resilience and how they were able to develop in such a fast pace, I think that really surprised me. You can kind of say this about many places around the world, that just globalization and the advance of technology really changed the world in the past like 20 years. But I think it's just even more evident how fast, specifically South Korea after the split, was able to create this huge global phenomenon known as the K wave. So, yeah, I feel like in a way it's also inspirational that, like, even when things historically are not going that well, in the end, the country can, well, pull itself together and end up creating things that the whole world can enjoy.
Why do you think Korean pop culture resonates so strongly globally compared to other countries' cultural exports?
I think that here in Korea, the media companies definitely know how to capitalize on global trends while also adding something that is more local. So, for example, like in the now popular movie K-pop Demon Hunters, well, they're kind of capitalizing on the already popular phenomenon of K-pop, but I feel like they also made sure to introduce a lot of aspects of Korean culture and Korean food, because I think recently there has been only an upsurge of people being interested in Korean food. And if you go back to things like Squid Games and just K-pop in general, I think because like it's not just one Korean wave, but it's like probably one wave after another. And I think here in Korea, I guess the people creating this entertainment, like K-pop and dramas and K-beauty and webtoons, I think they just want to make sure that there is something that is culturally, well, Korean, that can definitely distinguish it from other cultural exports, while also following trends that are already existent. So I guess, well, already using the popularity of K-pop as a trend on its own. However, I also think that Korean culture in general has just always been very high quality. You can tell that it has been made with a lot of care, so to speak, that they do treat their cultural export with care. Obviously, you probably can't say this about all the media, but at least I think that is the reason for K-drama popularity, is that it mixes things that everyone can relate to while also keeping that Korean touch. And that thing about people being able to relate to the content is definitely something that, well, brings a lot of success to Korean popular culture.
What is the influence of Korea and Ukraine in terms of diplomacy and culture?
So, as for diplomacy, I would say that Korea has definitely been quite helpful, especially because Ukraine has been at war for the past several years. And even though, for various reasons, such as North Korean presence and just the international geopolitical, I guess, tensions, South Korea has not been particularly open about its aid to Korea. It has mostly been done through other countries, so it has kind of acted as an intermediary, or otherwise just using other countries as intermediaries when sending things like aid. However, as for my knowledge, I think that at least the public rhetoric has been supportive of Ukraine, which I'm very grateful to, and as all Ukrainians are. And as for culture, I think there has definitely been quite an impact from Korea, not just in the form of the K wave, but because historically, I think from around the time of the Korean War, and maybe even before, there have been resettlements of Korean people all around the Soviet Union, and because Ukraine was part of it at the time, there's a lot of Koreans, like ethnically Korean people, and I believe they're called Koryo Saram or just Koryo-in, when to those people who currently still their generations reside in countries of previously the Soviet Union. So this situation is similar in Ukraine as well. And even though people don't necessarily know this history, I would say there's quite a big population of ethnically Korean people living in Ukraine. And you can also see this through food because, for example, we have this dish, which is basically a variation of Korean banchan, side dish, but it's just not one that you would find in Korea. However, it is something that the Korean people who live in Eastern Europe and Central Asia brought it to us, and because they didn't have access to the same ingredients as they would in Asia, they kind of made their own versions. So I feel like that is definitely something that people overlook, that not necessarily things that came from Korea and exported abroad, but also just the Korean people living in Ukraine for like decades and the kind of, well, input that they can bring to the local cuisine. I think that kind of thing is also very interesting. And obviously, as for the more recent decades, with all the K culture and K dramas and K pop, webtoons, also, I think Korean video games and Korean esports is also very popular. I can definitely see that there's a lot more Korean restaurants and also a lot more Korean like street food and things that you would see in K dramas and Korean film as well, just be out and about in Korea. So, for example, I feel like when I was little, I would never really see Korean products in Ukraine just in a supermarket, but I think in more recent years, I would even see Korean shampoos or just Korean shinramyeon, like I would just see it on the shelves in Ukraine. And I feel like the regular Korean person wouldn't even know how far reaching their popular culture has been. But it's true, like you can go to a supermarket in Ukraine, or I'm pretty sure in pretty much any country that has been affected by Korean popular culture, and you can just find Korean products on the shelf without having to go out of your way and look for it on the internet. Obviously, it's not that like you can find absolutely everything, but you can find tteokbokki, you can find ramyeon, you can find kimchi. So I would say the Korean soft power in a way has become very strong, and that yeah, like people in Ukraine continue to also show interest in Korea as it has been globally in the past recent years.